The lobby of one of the city's biggest companies was packed from wall to wall. Glass doors reflected rows of nervous faces, all waiting for the same opportunity. A banner near the entrance read, "Final round, corporate hiring interviews." For many, this job could change everything. Hundreds of candidates sat in long, orderly lines. Most wore crisp shirts, polished shoes, and confident expressions. Files rested neatly on their laps, resumes carefully printed, futures carefully imagined. Low murmurs filled the air, whispers about qualifications, experience, and who might impress the boss the most. Among them sat a quiet man, Seagal. Dressed simply, not flashy, Stephen didn't speak much. He observed. He watched how people behaved when they thought no one important was looking. The competition was intense, but Stephen remained calm, hands folded, eyes steady. Then something unusual happened. The glass doors opened again. A man stepped inside who didn't look like the others. His clothes were old and slightly worn. His shoes were simple, scuffed from years of use. His face looked tired, like someone who had worked hard all his life without many breaks. He held no fancy folder, just a thin envelope clutched tightly in his hands. The lobby grew quiet for a moment. The man glanced around, hesitated, then slowly walked toward the interview line and sat down at the end, keeping to himself. Almost instantly, a few nearby candidates exchanged looks. Smirks appeared. Quiet laughter followed. Stephen noticed everything. The poor man lowered his gaze, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to disappear into the floor. He said nothing. He didn't defend himself. He simply waited, just like everyone else. But in that crowded room full of ambition, pride, and judgment, something invisible had shifted. Because this interview was never going to be just about skills. And what was about to happen would reveal the true character of everyone in that room. At first, the whispers were quiet, almost harmless. A few candidates leaned toward each other, glancing at the poorly dressed man sitting at the end of the line. Smiles curled into smirks. Then the whispers turned into laughter. One man adjusted his expensive tie and scoffed. "Did you get lost?" he muttered loud enough to be heard. "This is a corporate interview, not a charity line." Another candidate laughed and added, "Look at his clothes. Does he even know where he is?" A few people nearby chuckled, enjoying the moment. To them, this felt like entertainment, something to break the tension of waiting. The poor man stiffened. His fingers tightened around the thin envelope in his hands. He looked down at the floor, avoiding eye contact, as if the tiles beneath his feet were suddenly the most interesting thing in the room. "People like you don't get jobs like this," someone else said. "You should try cleaning services instead." That comment drew louder laughter. No one from the staff intervened. No sign on the wall warned against disrespect. And so, the mockery continued, growing bolder with every second of silence. The poor man didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He simply swallowed the humiliation and remained seated, his posture shrinking, his presence almost fading. Seagal watched closely. He noticed how quickly confidence turned into cruelty. How easy it was for people to feel superior when they thought power was on their side. He saw the fear behind the laughter, the fear that someone like this man didn't belong, because his presence reminded them that success is not always visible. The line moved slowly forward. Names were called. Candidates stood up and returned, some smiling, others tense. Yet the mocking glances kept returning to the poor man, as if his mere existence was an insult to the room. Stephen shifted slightly in his seat. Something about this wasn't right. This wasn't competition anymore. It was judgment. And in a room full of people desperate to be chosen, most of them didn't realize they were already being tested, just not in the way they expected. Have you ever seen someone judged by appearance? Tell us, what country and city are you watching from? The mocking continued, growing louder with every passing minute. The poor man kept his head down, quiet and composed, but the laughter and whispers seemed to pierce the air around him like invisible needles. Some candidates leaned back in their chairs, smirking, convinced that their superiority was obvious. Seagal, sitting a few seats away, had been watching quietly the entire time. His calm eyes missed nothing, the sneers, the jokes, the subtle gestures meant to humiliate. He could see the man's discomfort, the way his shoulders hunched and fingers gripped the thin envelope, trying to hold himself together in the storm of ridicule. Finally, Stephen could no longer remain silent. He stood up, walking slowly toward the poor man. A hush fell over the line as candidates noticed his movement. "You can sit with me," Stephen said clearly, offering his seat beside him. "And no one has the right to mock someone just because of their clothes or appearance." The other candidates froze, some shifting uncomfortably, realizing they had been caught in their own cruelty. A few laughed nervously, trying to hide embarrassment. Others scowled, unwilling to let their pride slip. Stephen looked around, meeting the eyes of those who had been laughing. A person's value is not defined by what they wear or how they look, he said firmly. It is measured by their character, their honesty, and their integrity. The poor man slowly lifted his head, a quiet gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. He took the seat next to Stephen, remaining silent but clearly relieved to have an ally in a room full of judgment. Some of the candidates shifted uncomfortably, realizing their behavior had crossed a line. Others continued to smile sarcastically, unwilling to admit they were wrong. But the atmosphere had changed. The laughter had faded. The whispers had quieted. Stephen sat back, calm and composed, watching the poor man as the line slowly began to move. Names were called. Candidates stood, some nervously, others confidently. Yet now, the focus was no longer on mocking, it was on observing, on measuring not just skills, but courage and integrity. In that moment, it became clear, this interview was no longer just a test of qualifications. It had become a test of humanity, of empathy, and of who among them truly understood the value of respect. If you were in Stephen's place, would you stand up for someone being humiliated? Comment stand if you believe in courage. The line continued to inch forward, candidates standing up when their names were called, walking toward the interview rooms with a mixture of confidence and anxiety. The poor man stayed seated beside Steven Seagal, his hand still clutching the thin envelope, eyes quietly fixed on the floor. He said nothing, spoke nothing, yet his presence now carried a weight that the room could no longer ignore. The air was thick with tension. The candidates who had mocked him earlier shifted in their seats, glancing at him nervously, unsure if they should continue their whispers or stay silent. Some of the smirks were gone, replaced with awkward glances and guilt. Others pretended to be indifferent, but the change in atmosphere was undeniable. Stephen leaned slightly toward the man and whispered, "Don't worry about them. Let your actions speak, not their words." The poor man nodded subtly, acknowledging the support without saying a word. His silence was dignified, almost magnetic, and it drew attention. Even those who had initially laughed now found themselves quietly observing, realizing that humor at someone else's expense was both petty and shallow. Minutes passed, and the boardroom calls grew louder. One by one, candidates left the line, stepping into their interviews with a mix of nerves and ambition. The poor man remained seated, quiet and patient, unbothered by the uncertainty around him. Stephen watched carefully, noting every expression, every flicker of emotion on the faces of those who had mocked and those who had remained neutral. He knew something was about to happen, something that would reveal more than just skills or qualifications. The poor man's calmness began to contrast sharply with the growing unease of the others. His quiet confidence became a silent statement: strength isn't always loud, and courage doesn't always need words. The room seemed to hold its breath. The candidates, the staff, even the air itself felt charged, as if waiting for the next moment to unfold. The poor man's unassuming presence had shifted the energy in the room, making everyone aware of something far greater than resumes or credentials. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a subtle test of character, empathy, and integrity. And everyone present, whether they realized it or not, was about to be judged, not by their qualifications, but by how they had treated someone less fortunate in the same room. In that tense silence, the first true cracks in arrogance and judgment began to appear. And quietly, without words, the poor man had already begun to win the respect of those who truly understood what it meant to value character over appearances. The next morning, Steven Seagal's phone rang. He answered quickly, a mixture of curiosity and cautious excitement in his expression. "Congratulations," a cheerful voice announced on the other end. "You've been shortlisted. Please come to the boss's office at your earliest convenience." Stephen hung up, feeling a surge of excitement. He had expected a tough interview process, but the confirmation of his progress filled him with pride. Not just for himself, but for the quiet integrity he had witnessed and supported the day before. He arrived at the office building a short while later. The lobby was bustling again, but this time, the atmosphere was different, calm yet tense, as if the air itself sensed that something unusual was about to happen. As Stephen walked into the boardroom, he noticed familiar faces. The same candidates who had laughed and mocked the poor man yesterday were already seated, their expressions a mix of confidence and apprehension. Some whispered nervously, recalling their own behavior and wondering if it would come back to haunt them. Stephen took his seat quietly, scanning the room, observing the tension, and noticing the subtle shifts in body language. He could feel the unspoken realization spreading among those who had mocked someone simply because of appearances. The boardroom door opened, and a hush fell over everyone. All eyes turned toward the entrance. A man stepped inside, familiar, yet transformed. Gone were the worn-out clothes, the tired shoes, and the humbled demeanor. In their place was a crisp, formal suit. His posture was confident. His presence commanded attention. Everyone froze. The room seemed to pause for a heartbeat, caught between disbelief and awe. The man walked calmly toward the boss's chair and sat down, exuding authority and calm assurance. Silence filled the room. The candidates who had mocked him lowered their heads, a wave of shame washing over them. The air was thick with tension, anticipation, and the weight of revelation. Stephen watched, understanding immediately that this was no ordinary interview day. Something greater was unfolding, a lesson not in skills or qualifications, but in character, empathy, and the true measure of a person. The room waited, breathless, as the boss prepared to speak. And in that silence, everyone realized that the events of the previous day were about to take on a significance none of them had anticipated. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a test of humanity, and the results were about to be revealed. The boardroom was silent, every eye fixed on the man in the sharp suit now seated confidently in the boss's chair. The candidates who had mocked him just yesterday stared in disbelief, their earlier arrogance replaced by shock, and, in some cases, shame. The boss, a calm and composed figure, smiled knowingly. Yesterday, he began, his voice cutting through the tense air, I was not the boss in this room. He paused, letting the words sink in. I was observing, like any other candidate, to see who would treat a fellow human being with respect, regardless of appearance. Gasps filled the room. The once mocked man looked calm, collected, and unshaken. His transformation was more than just clothing, it was the undeniable proof of his dignity and composure under scrutiny. The candidates who had laughed turned pale, avoiding eye contact. The smug smiles they had worn yesterday were gone. They realized now that their judgment had been shallow, cruel, and revealing, not of the poor man, but of themselves. Seagal, seated a few rows away, observed quietly, a small nod acknowledging the courage and patience the man had shown. He had known instinctively that there was more to the story, and now it was unfolding. The boss's gaze swept across the room. I wanted to see who valued character over appearances. Who had the courage to stand up for what is right. Who could see a person for their humanity, not their clothes or status. All eyes then turned toward Seagal. The boss continued, his tone firm but kind, only one person passed my test. The room seemed to hold its breath. Stephen, humble and composed, rose slightly as the weight of the moment settled around him. The candidates who had mocked the poor man lowered their heads in shame, silently acknowledging that their behavior had failed this simple, yet profound test of character. The man in the suit did not speak. He did not gloat. He had passed his own quiet test by maintaining dignity and patience. His presence alone had spoken volumes about strength, humility, and humanity. The boss finally smiled warmly at Stephen. This job, he said, belongs to you. You showed what true integrity looks like. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Power, status, and skill can impress, but integrity, empathy, and respect define who truly deserves honor. If you believe respect should be given to every person, regardless of appearance, type respect in the comments. The room, once filled with mockery, now brimmed with silent reflection. And in that silence, a lesson had been learned, one that none present would ever forget. The boardroom remained quiet, heavy with the weight of the revelation. The candidates who had mocked the man the day before sat in stunned silence, their eyes downcast, faces pale. The smugness, arrogance, and careless laughter of the previous day had vanished entirely. They had been confronted, not by words, but by a living demonstration of patience, dignity, and integrity. Seagal remained calm, seated with quiet confidence. He understood that this moment was about far more than a job. It was about humanity. About recognizing the worth of a person, not by their appearance, clothing, or social status, but by their character. He glanced at the man in the suit, the one who had quietly endured ridicule, and offered a subtle, respectful nod. The man returned it with a slight smile, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared understanding. The boss, still smiling, finally spoke, his voice carrying authority yet tempered with warmth. I have watched every action in this room. Every glance, every word, every choice of behavior. And I have seen who values human dignity above superficial judgments. He paused, letting the moment settle. Then, Turning toward the candidates who had mocked the man, he said, "Look at yourselves. Your judgment, your laughter, your arrogance, these were not unnoticed. Humility and respect cannot be faked, and today you have learned that the true test of a person's character is revealed not when they are praised, but when they are confronted with the vulnerable and the marginalized." The room was silent. The lessons were clear, and the weight of shame hung heavily on those who had failed the test. Finally, the boss addressed Stephen directly. "Only one person passed my test. This job, this opportunity, belongs to someone who demonstrates integrity, empathy, and courage. Stephen, congratulations. You are the one I trust to represent not only this company but also the values it stands for." Stephen rose, accepting the acknowledgement with humility. He knew that the moment was bigger than him, bigger than the job itself. It was about standing up for what is right, about giving others dignity when it is due, and about demonstrating that true strength lies in character, not appearances. The man in the suit did not speak publicly, but his presence alone had left an indelible mark on everyone in the room. The lesson was not lost. Respect, patience, and integrity cannot be taught, they must be lived. As Stephen left the boardroom later, he reflected on the events. The story, already circulating among the staff and soon to be shared more widely, carried a simple yet profound message: skills can be taught, but honesty, empathy, and humanity cannot. In a world that often values appearance over essence, this day had proven that true character is always visible to those who choose to see. Medium White Star. If you believe no one should be judged by appearance, type respect in the comments. Medium White Star. Subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.